Hi everyone, thank you for coming back. Can I invite you to take your seats? We're going to just start the next session really soon. Thank you. Now, our first ESG panel talked a little bit about storytelling and story doing, but our next panel is really going to dive into how to shape your sustainability story. So please welcome our panelists, Elaine Chan, Director of Marketing Communications, Park Royal Collection, Marina Bay, Singapore. Rob Cabus, Chief Insight Officer and Managing Partner at Data Text. And Tham Kok Wing, Director of Robertsbridge, Stonehaven, Singapore. Our moderator is Robin Goh, SVP and Head Group Communications and Marketing at Certis. And unfortunately, Deepi Pathik is unable to join us today and sends her regrets. Over to you, Robin.
Thank you so much, Ingfen. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thank you. All right, we're just going to wait for stragglers coming in from the tea break. It's wonderful to see everyone. I've got old friends, and some young ones. And again, I want to thank the last panel, Jason, Lars, Sochin, and then Xiao Wei, obviously, for a very nice segue into what we're going to talk about. We obviously spoke about the sustainability agenda. I think that's one thing that we can all agree upon, that it is something that is a top of mind for a lot of us and a lot of companies as well. Well, one thing's for certain, obviously, there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to ESG communications, and this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. Again, you know, the leadership of ESG, why ESG is obviously important for the world, for the companies, for our future generations, and what we're going to do is actually deep dive a little bit more. We're all communicators in the room, and there are two things, right? I'm going to just get out of the way for now. Again, we all know, right? So much of a company's reputation is riding on its sustainability blueprint, and that's number one, and number two, how that is being communicated, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about at this panel, right? We spoke about the leadership of ESG. We're going to talk about the how, right, in this panel. All right. So, what are perhaps some of the best practices that we've seen, done over the past years? Some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges as communicators. How do we develop, drive, shape, sharpen the sustainability storytelling of the companies we represent? Okay, and shedding more light, obviously, is our esteemed panel. So joining us this morning, we have Elaine Chan, who is Director of Marketing, Communications and Sustainability at Park Royal Collection, Marina Bay, Singapore. We have Robert Cabus, who is Managing Partner and Chief Insights Officer at Dataset. And of course, Mr. Tham Kok Wing, who is Director of Robertsbridge, Stonehaven, Singapore. All right, unfortunately, as what Ingfen said, Preeti had some issues back home, and she sends her regards, and we wish her well. Well, morning, everyone, and welcome. Well, let me first begin with you, Kok Wing. You obviously are in the business of helping companies achieve sustainability transformation. What are some of the more common pitfalls? And we, again, communicators in the room, from a communicator's point of view, some of the pitfalls that perhaps you've experienced.
Right, thank you. So I'm just going to carry over from the previous panel. I think they've already kind of set the stage. What I'm going to start off with to say is that of all the companies that I have spoken to so far, consultant, one thing stands out, and since I'm talking to a room full of communicators, people who are storytellers, I'll say the first thing we need to understand is that this whole journey, the ESG journey, is essentially transformation. It's all about change management. So if you're a communicator, understand that you are telling the story of this journey of change. And change is complex. Right? Even a change in organization means that you need to transform the way you do business, the way you approach your stakeholders, even revamping your whole business process. So that's the challenge that you need to make sure, going back to the point, about organizational leadership. It goes back right to the top, to your board, to your management, to make sure that they've got a very clear idea where they are heading to. I've got instances in the last 6 months where I've come across CEOs who come to me happily and say, Kok Wing, I want to be net zero carbon by 2023. It starts off with somebody, a competitor, who goes out and says, I want to be net zero by 2030, and being a competitive business, I want to do it earlier. But I would say 9 times out of 10, they may not know what they've signed up for. And this will set the stage for people like you and your partners within the organization to sweep the streets. And this is where greenwashing will come about. This is where I think there's a question on crisis around reputation will come out. So I think first point is that for you to tell the story, you need to know your plot. And very basic thing is that for you to know your plot, you need to know what's your sustainability goals for your organization. Very simple. Make sure that it's nailed down, that your board and your management has bought into it, and you've got a very clear path, a clear blueprint. Then I think you'll be better able to answer the questions and also to manage the crisis that will come your way.
Well, thanks for that, Kok Wing. And needless to say, right, we did speak about this earlier in the panel as well, that communicators or PR practitioners like we obviously need that seat, right, on the sustainability steerco of the company so that we, again, can develop, drive, shape, and sharpen, you know, the sustainability story of the journey that the company is going through.
Yeah,
now, speaking,
I wonder if that maybe...
Well done, yeah. Go ahead, Rob.
You know, I just wanted to amplify because of how important that is, because, you know, I know in some work that I've done, like with Hulu some years back, you know, we were having that conversation about what their goals were, but the way they were thinking about it was, okay, we need to get certain metrics of diversity in our company, and our point of view was, no, you need to have diversity because you're an entertainment company, and your best chance of driving massive entertainment across the US population is going to be based on your ability to represent that population. So the why and the goals, you know, have to be something that people get excited about, they see as connected to their business, and there's a high level that makes it easy to say, how are we going to do that? You know, by starting with metrics, I think it becomes a little bit more, you know, almost obligatory than it is mission.
Good point, Rob. I'm going to pivot a little bit to Elaine. I want to highlight an industry that was obviously devastated by the pandemic, so much so that many of them use this opportunity to kind of reset what I call the sustainability counters. You know, Elaine, in your experience, and obviously coming from hospitality, do you think as a group, right, as a whole, and even the property that you work for, how has it, you know, in terms of how has it been performing? Has it been fully embraced, you know, has it fully embraced the sustainability journey so far?
Good morning, everyone. We not only reset, we renovated. So fortunately, when pandemic started, I think this was in January, and in March, our hotel underwent a renovation. But we did not take a reconstruction approach, we took a rejuvenation approach. So that means we enhanced the existing assets. Fortunately as well, because if we had pulled down the whole building, it will not, you know, what we say today will not align at all. If we had pulled down the whole building, it would have been an estimated of 51,000 metric tons of carbon emission. And that's equivalent to about 8.7 million trees, more trees than Singapore has. So when we renovated, our owners took on the approach of sustainability. We want to do, you know, we wanted to start right. We wanted to incorporate sustainability in our design. And we took a very holistic approach. We looked at plastic waste management, so that's where we installed our water filter taps, so we eliminated plastic bottles in the rooms. We looked at energy management, so we have motion sensors, we built our solar panels on a rooftop. We looked at water management, we changed our shower heads to low flow. And then we looked at food waste management, you know, so we installed our food waste digesters. We built our own urban farm that supplies about 20% of our hotel's requirements. So yes, I believe we have embraced wholeheartedly, not only in our design, but also, this was spread across internally to our associates, and make sure that everybody is aligned what we're doing in a hotel and what we're trying to achieve. Thanks.
And this came all the way from the top, obviously. All the way from the top, right?
Yeah, all the way from the top.
All right. This brings me to perhaps one of the bigger questions from PR practitioners across the room, and it's for Robert. So Rob, from your experience, bearing in mind that this is after all a journey, with milestones, right? If a company even meets them in the first place, how do we, as comms professionals, then encapsulate the overall ESG strategy, develop the communications, the narrative surrounding it, and again, at different points and at different juncture of the journey, how do we then do that?
Yeah, I think a good starting point for that is, because I hear confusion about it, is, what is strategy? And just very simply, right, it's how are you going to address all the challenges and overcome all the obstacles between here and your goals? So the thing we have to avoid, is thinking about our strategy as, like you were saying, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2028. That's a business mission, and that's great, but what is your strategy in terms of being able to, do that? And just maybe to pivot off another thing you said about competition, is one of the things that just for full disclosure, I come a lot from a brand and integrated marketing strategy background, so you can dismiss or or take, some of the things that I say. But I think that idea of competition is another one of those, potential traps that you think about. What I've learned from working with a lot of great brands is that they're focused first and foremost on why are they doing what they're doing, what are they bringing people, what is the value, and how does everything we do feed off of that and support it. And knowing your competition, of course, everybody knows that. But if you go into a meeting with Apple or Adidas, pre-Kanye, or any of these brands, what they really want to hear about is, what are we doing? So I think that's a key thing in terms of thinking about the journey going forward. The next step, for me, is being able to think about it in a holistic way. I think the thing we try and do certainly is be able to look at the integrated story, because from a consumer standpoint, right, like they don't care if it's coming from mainstream or social or where it is. So how does that work? And I see a wide spectrum in terms of how organizations either get integrated or don't. And I think to the examples earlier of the people who are doing it well, and there could be some debate about it, but whether it's Patagonia or Unilever or other people, or whether it's just great brands and how they're great brands, there's an all-in nature. There's absolute clarity about why they're doing what they're doing. So I think the sustainability story, the ESG story, is really predicated upon people embracing about why it actually drives their business, why they're there, and look at it in integrated fashion. Because if you're just thinking about an aspect of storytelling without how it's landing and what effect it's having, then it's not really commercially viable, and it's not going to actually thrive long-term in an organization.
Let me add on to what Rob has said. So I think Elaine has given some very nice examples. I think in the last few years, a lot of people have been talking about the ESG journey, and a lot of it that surrounds it are very soft targets. That sometimes it can't help that people accuse of just playing up fluff. And this is where I call the 3Ds coming in very important for communicators. You got to be very clear. First is data, which I think Elaine has really kind of shared with you. You got very clear data, got very clear goals. Secondly, definitions. ESG, as it's evolved, is still anyone's game, right? In terms of reporting even, there's no global standards. There are different people following different standards for different purposes, satisfying different audiences. So make sure that your definitions is something that people can understand and accept and take you for who you are. And the third D is disclosure, right? And this goes back to the point that Prof. Tommy Cole stated out in the day. First thing, the 5 lessons that he learned. Yes, disclosure is one, right? You make sure that disclosure, which is transparent, yeah, which is authentic. And if you've got these 3Ds kind of aligned, then I think, not that you have an easier time, but I think you've got a clearer picture of where you're heading towards, and it makes your communications a lot more cogent and consistent.
And I think one of the more troubling for me, and obviously, I've been doing PR for many years. I think one of the things that troubled me as a practitioner is also at which juncture, what tools do you use to make that disclosure, as what both Kok Wing and Rob has mentioned, and maybe I'll turn that question to you, Elaine. I think anecdotally, obviously, you've got, the properties and the group has done good stuff with some of the things that you guys have put in place in terms of renovating and everything else. How then, again, anecdotally from your experience, how then did you kind of spread that message and ensure, that your target audiences, took in exactly what you said?
I think it starts from within as well. So it's two parts: internal and external. Internal, we have to get buy-in. Our staff, they truly embrace it now. I mean, after 1.5 years of talking about it. I mean, in the mornings, you see our chefs in the urban farm harvesting for what they need for the day. In the afternoon, you see the mixologists harvesting for their cocktails. In all through the day, you see spa therapists in the farm harvesting for the infused tea. So internally, we need to get buy-in. And in turn, they also help us to communicate. In turn, they're also very proud that they're working for a responsible company. Externally, we work with, we work on various channels. Of course, we use our social media very actively. We also work with OTAs, online travel agents, where, if you notice, if you go on booking.com, if you go on expedia.com, you can actually filter sustainable hotel or sustainable accommodation search now. And, we made sure that we're a part of that search. We're listed. And in order to be listed, we also have to prove why we deserve to be listed as or featured as a sustainable accommodation. So Expedia has a pledge that we have to renew every year. Booking.com requires a submission, so we have to share our data, we have to share on our sustainability efforts. So these are the various channels that we use to ensure that our consumers know about us and know what our goals are.
Well, thanks for that, Elaine. I'm going to open questions to the floor. So I'm going to keep going, and if I see any one of you just stand up and just walk to the mics, I'm going to stop and... Yes, Ken, there we go.
Hi, Ken.
I can't resist asking questions, and I'd encourage all considerably younger PR people to be a bit more forthcoming and don't hesitate to ask questions. But as Elaine knows, and some of the others know, that I'm still a journalist at heart with a strong sustainability leaning and a strong PR leaning. So somehow I bring it all together at different times, and I'm still going. What Elaine didn't mention was she featured, or her sustainability work with the hotel featured in the latest issue of Asian Journeys. So I worked with her to produce a story about the sustainability efforts of Park Royal Collection. And to be honest, I mean, I went into this quite independently, without any influence from PR people initially, where I wanted to look at a number of hotels in Singapore that had taken moves in the sustainability direction. And there were 6 hotels I chose because I had either stayed at them or been involved with them for many years, about 4 decades, in fact. And the Park Royal Collection just happened to be one of those hotels that used to have another name, and it started in 1987. 1987? I got it right. So if I have a few copies of this magazine, if anyone wants to read a good story about sustainability in Singapore involving hotels, etc., I've got some copies to give away. And Elaine's done an incredibly good job internally and externally. So good on. Keep it up.
Thank you, Ken.
Well done, Elaine. Thank you, Ken. That's an excellent plug. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, thank you.
Hi.
Okay.
this works.
Yes, it does.
Hi, I'm Eileen. Thanks for all the insights that you've shared. I have a question. We have heard a lot about ESG today at this panel and the one before. And a lot of the conversations has focused on the letter E and the letter S. So my question is about the letter G, which I would like the panel to help to address in terms of communicating that to the external audience as well as the internal audience to get buy-in. Because I think G, the governance, is something more difficult for people to understand. Thank you.
And not just more difficult, isn't it? I think some people would keep it to the compliance departments and certain departments within the organization. And, you know, from my experience, sometimes they don't involve the employee communications team, right? Because it's just within the protocols of the company. And it's just, yeah, and that's a very good question. Thank you so much, Eileen. Yeah. So, Kok Wing, can I?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a shot at that. So you're absolutely right. ESG, I think the E and the S tend to take center stage for whatever reason. I will tell you that E is probably very technical and complex. Not many people will understand. The S part is important. So, Chin, to your point, in fact, there is actually measurement from S that goes into the E, and I'll elaborate that a little later. And the G part is just as important. I've mentioned disclosure. That's part of governance. Transparency, trackability. And on top of that, if your organization or management is taking sustainability seriously, you would have already set up your sustainability committee, you would have your sustainability policy. All that is part of governance, and that's internal. External to you, and especially if you're in Singapore, you'll be very clear. Singapore government has already made certain commitments publicly, internationally, right? I think right now at COP27, they're going to move fast forward, yeah? Their climate goals. And already you have legislation in place in Singapore. I can name you a whole slew. And the most probably prominent is your carbon tax, followed by ERP, which is your extended producer responsibilities. All these are actually legislated. So if you're a business, you will not be able to run away. It's part of your governance, yeah? Especially for the bigger business. But equally for smaller business, to the point that I think one of the previous panelists highlighted, Xiao Wei, right? Many businesses that I spoke to, especially the small ones, will say, hey, Kok Wei, in 2030, 2040, 2050, is 20 years away. Why should I start now? The insights to that is that while you may be a small business, you are part of a larger supply chain. And if the Unilevers of the world, the P&Gs of the world, the Shells of the world start really pressing and delivering on their commitments, they will make sure that you in the supply chain needs to fall into place. If you don't, guess what? You'll be out of business. So it's as simple as that. So maybe I start with that answer. Maybe the others can embellish.
Yeah, I'll just also, yeah, and this might be sort of intersection of G and brand, but we were talking earlier, or panel was talking earlier about Twitter, right? And wouldn't work for Elon Musk or that kind of thing. But I think the question is, what's coming next, right? So there's the blue check, which I think is going to create even more chaos out there. And I think just having Elon Musk leading this thing. So I think it's now going to become an issue about who does business with Twitter, because they don't really survive without brands doing that. So I think the next stage of anticipation for that'll be a litmus test for a lot of companies is, are you showing up on Twitter in a big way at a time when it's quite potentially going to devolve into a bit more of a shit show, or not? So I think G is going to take on a little bit of a higher profile coming up, and I think this will be one of the catalysts for that.
Thank you. Any more questions? So back to just go ahead and ask questions, and if you guys have any. Rob, you were just talking about this. Where does data sit in all of this? And I'm going to talk about the big G of greenwashing in a bit. But where does data sit in kind of communicating that story to members of the public?
Hello? No. I think a starting point for, for this one for me is the idea of where does data fit into storytelling, or story doing, or story landing, with that. And I think the important thing is that data is the foundation for everything you do. So even the stuff we talked about earlier about who you are, why you're here, what value you bring to audiences, right? That's a data-infused qualitative and quantitative conversation. But I think it's recognizing the sweet spot, right? You don't want to be data-led storytelling, right? You want to be insight-led storytelling. So how are you data-fed, insight-led, so to speak, in terms of how you do that? I also talked a little bit earlier about integration, and I think it requires, having a framework that just takes you a bit through the ability to actually look at this holistically across an organization. So even if I take it from a sort of comm standpoint and say, the foundational measures are awareness, the ability to get a story on the radar, credibility and believability, and then influence and impact. That applies across the organization for all marketing and communications and PR you do. So, what we often do is try and just find a simple framework that allows us to then think about how data is informing each one of those stages and each one of those deliverables. And then there's always the element of, obviously, customization, which is what specifically, who are you as a brand, and what are you specifically trying to achieve? So I think there's consistent things that apply to almost all data frameworks that are set up. But then there's the customization of the beginning and end of that piece to say, I guess it would be a metric of, or maybe a litmus test, if you could pick up a sustainability strategy and move it over to another company and be okay, it's probably not a great strategy, right? So, how are you doing that in the journey? So I think those are foundational, but, like I said, it does, start with data and the ability to actually gather it comprehensively, enrich it, and then distill it down to what's relevant is a lot of the magic, of what sort of automation and AI brings. But then it's the human sort of layer of that, which allows you to think through strategically how data informs your story at the key junctures.
Colby? Yep.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Data will give you insights. But when it comes to ESG, I can tell you that there's a dearth of that. It's really very little E and S and G data out there. So all this that we are talking about, the carbon accounting, the different quantifications and capture and the reporting, that forms the basis. And there are actually specialists out there right now looking at the collation of this data. And for you people out there who are business-minded, this is the gold mine. This is the gold mine. Because from the data, you'll be able to do predictive analysis, projections of your carbon footprint, and 101 things, which financial institutions, your investor community, your shareholders, and people from the industry would be after. So that data right now is getting built up. And I can also tell you that the other lens, why is government, especially here, pushing you to report your waste data? Because there's nothing for them to work on. How do they arrive at taxing you when it comes to carbon tax? They need data first. Without data, they can't create their model before they come to you. So data in the ESG sense is a gold mine, all right? And it's waiting to be built up. And we're doing it right now. And we heard from Elaine. Now the hotel has started gathering all this carbon data. In time to come, give it a couple of years, this will be very, very critical. And already I can tell you there are people out there who are data scientists with deep analytics and machine learning tapping using this data.
I think that brings up another good point of the different audiences out there. And I do think it usually, it always has to start with one bigger idea, but you're right, as you're talking to shareholders, industry leaders, and those audiences, that works, perfectly. And I think that's going to be the big opportunity going forward. The one thing I would say for consumer, public audiences out there is go beyond, some of the data. You can't run a survey now without getting a response that this is really important. Every consumer will say, basically that this is critical. But when you look at the actual behaviors that are happening based on the data you can get, from media intelligence and real-time analytics, you're seeing a very different story. You're seeing a lot of people talking about very high-minded stories, 2040 goals, things like that, that are great for certain audiences, but they don't really land. It's kind of the analogy of walking through the airport, and I couldn't tell you a lot of their ESG stories of these companies I walk past, but when I get to the water bottle where I fill it up in there and I see that I'm part of saving 850 million plastic bottles, that's pretty awesome. So it's just human nature. It's how do you connect with the stuff that's personal, that we care about, and that data is available and needs to be connected in order to actually take it to the final mile, or almost the final mile as well.
All right, good insights there. Now, I was hoping that this word wouldn't come up, but it would, it will, it has. The G word, right, that's greenwashing, and I think the first panel, right, beat us to it. So we all know, we don't have to talk about it, we all know that it's a no-no. Is there a possibility that PR practitioners like us do it unwittingly in the hope to, whatever you call it, jump on the bandwagon, being a little bit too, perhaps, enthusiastic about targets or what we're doing within the company? It's natural, right? Because we want to make the news. Is this possible? Have you guys seen it? Right? Elaine, why don't we start from you? Do you think that we unwittingly do this and commit this sin?
I think it's possible, but I think it's also because of pressure, a lot of pressure on the market, a lot of pressure from competition to keep up with competition. For our hotel, when we started talking about sustainability, we just wanted to share all the beautiful things that we're doing. We never thought of, we're going to beat our competitor, we're going to be number one, we're going to be doing the most. We never thought that way. But it just so happened that throughout this journey, we just realized, actually, it has given us a huge competitive advantage. But we make sure that we track, right? I mean, we were talking about data, we made sure that we track. Because whatever we put out there is open for public scrutiny. So I think, unwittingly, yes, it could potentially have happened or potentially happened, but I think it's just this pressure out there to keep up.
Thank you, Elaine. Rob, you've got some comments on greenwashing?
Well, I'd agree with the premise of the way you asked the question, which was unwittingly. I don't think a lot of people are sitting there thinking like, how can we scheme?
Exactly, I want to do it.
To do this. I think it just ties in with the insight earlier about, ideally you want to be in a place which is you actually believe these things, you're doing these things, and now you're talking about these things. But that order doesn't always happen, or there's ways of talking about things or promoting things that, to your point, just kind of maybe getting driven by competitive things. So I think, the answer to that, I'd say absolutely, yeah. I think a lot of it is unwitting and just kind of like lost in some. There's always a piece of dysfunctionality in the process, and that's probably where it manifests.
Good point. Good point. Kobe?
Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, I think some people do get themselves kind of enmeshed in this unwittingly and sometimes unconsciously. So I'll give you an example. And this is not to be pointing fingers or blame at the comms person. I've come across very recently a company who's got very good intent. So they went out and got themselves a green label, which is great. But I think unbeknownst to the communicator, there are different types of green labels. Yeah, different types meaning different things, different level of credibility. And so this is where there's that trip. This is where you can trip yourself over, because to a knowing crowd, especially to an NGO, they'll take you to task, right? You claim you've got a green label. What kind of green label? What does it do for your brand or for your product? So this is one instance. The other instance I've already kind of alluded to is that you may have a very aggressive, aspirational CEO who says, I want to be carbon neutral by 2023. Great. Can you deliver that? So that is something which is left to the comms people to sweep the streets. And this is where, to the point that, yes, you need to have a seat at the table for a comms person or a PR person, but you need then to be able to know your story, as well as you need to have enough of that depth to bring that conversation to relevance, so that at the end of the day, you won't end up bearing that burden. Because, lo and behold, your CEO will say, that's your job. Go do it. Yeah, go handle it.
Thank you so much, Kok Weng. Any last questions? Yes, please. Okay, tell about last two. So Pamani, I'll end with you, yeah?
Yeah.
Please.
Hi, I'm Kelvin from TrueScope. So we actually talk a lot about shaping the sustainable story during this discussion. And coming from a measurement perspective, I have a lot of clients asking me, how do I know whether my story gets through to the audience or not? How do I then measure the success of my sustainability story? So, Kok Wing, you talked about the 3Ds, and I think one part of the 3Ds would be standards, right? Should there be a standard for sustainability measurement, which is a little bit more vague, right, than measuring brand impact and counting number of media mentions? So, seeking the expertise of the people on the panel on, any recommendations of what brands should be looking out for.
Thank you, Kelvin.
So maybe let me get the ball rolling. So Kevin, thanks for the question. Like I said, in the ESG realm that we are dealing with right now, there's no one global standard for everything. And in fact, different sectors or different industries would have their own point of reference. So if you're in the build sector, you'll probably be referencing a set of standards or practices different from for instance, aviation or maritime or even the leisure sector. So there's no one size fits all, but what I can say is that when you set up your quantification and your goals, make sure that you have that sense that it is something that's relevant and credible, either backed up by aligned to some ISO at the minimum. ISO is not the be-all and end-all, because ISO is just a process. You may need to go deeper. So what I'm saying is that go out, first of all, asking yourself, what is it that you need to measure? What is critical material to your business? And then nail down those data points. From there, work backwards. Go back to your industry, go back to your industry association, go back to your own, partners within the industry, and deliver a certain point of reference. So I think that's the starting. Yeah. And I think there will come a time when it comes to reporting, there will be some standards. So watch out, COP27, International SSB, they are setting up a global standard, so to say, for reporting. That's for financial reporting. So that's one reference point. But like I said, different industries would measure different things. Yeah? So it is to my younger colleagues out there, this thing on sustainability has got a long runway. So there's a lot that you can do out there. So you're talking about targets in 2050, 2060. I'll be part of the carbon by then, but you'll still be around. Yeah. So this is the runway for all of you. So take this seriously. There's a lot of opportunities out there.
I think jumping on also what Kok Wing said, that there's no one size fit all for all industries. For example, the hotel industry. The Singapore Hotel Sustainability Roadmap was launched in, I think, March this year. And it's a tall order, right? All hotels in Singapore, we have to start tracking emission by 2023. 60% of our total room stock in Singapore, I think we're just short of about 69,000 rooms. So we have to, by 2025, 60% of our total room stock must have international certification. So that would include like LEED, which is Leadership in Energy and Environment. That's also GSTC, Global Sustainable Tourism Certification. And then by 2050, we have to be net zero. No pressure. So we have a lot of work to do. I'm just sharing from the hotel industry side.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add that if we're in a position of responsibility for a brand or reputation, we're starting with very specific measures about what attributes are important to our brand, and the key is connecting those to the end. So in other words, if your upfront values and attributes are we want to be known as community minded, we want to be known as responsive, we want to be known as inclusive, whatever those are, but at the end of the process, let's say I'm going to come back to the kind of world of social and communications. If your end measures are what are the top channels, what are the top posts, who are the top, authors. That's a big disconnect. So there are ways of actually connecting that data all the way through to the measures that are specifically important to your brand and your business, and that's what needs to be in place in order for people to start to understand, what it's doing. And then you just look at it in a couple of ways. One is, are you known for that? And then also you can just kind of take a look at those issues holistically and say, out of all the people who are known for that, where do you fit on that spectrum? So there's a couple of different ways you can start to play with the data once you have that allow you to be able to put metrics to say, okay, here we are and here's where we need to go.
Thanks for that, guys. Okay, last two questions, right? We have to go. Yes.
Get very quick. First, I just wondering if all this compliance that we have to do would raise costs, because that's being discussed this morning, with all the carbon pricing that's being introduced here. So in an organization, how do we then balance all these different interests and try and communicate the benefits of ESG to your different stakeholders? That's one question. The second thing is, I think it's to Kok Wing. With all these standards that are expected and goals that companies should set, do you see more legislation being introduced to pressurize companies and organizations to make changes?
Okay, so maybe, Bhavani, thanks. I'll address the first question first. Yes, definitely. And I go back to my first point at the start of this panel. When you go to a transformation, when you go to change, it's inevitable you need to invest, all right? So for any business, and I'll say business with an eye to the future, and for CEOs who are enlightened enough not to see in the short term, what I'm going to do in the next quarter, what I'm going to achieve this year. You need to look 5 years, 10 years down the road. And this is where the investment is needed. So I agree, it will involve costs, but I think there are ways to tap into funding, whether it's provided by government, there are different schemes, or you can go to a bank. Increasingly, the banks here in Singapore specifically are under pressure to green their portfolios, meaning that there are lots of green loans, sustainability loans out there waiting to be taken up because they're under pressure from MAS to show that they're moving the needle away from brown and black investments, right? So that would be one piece of good news that will kind of balance each other off. The second point is, yes, I think that's how Singapore works, right? It's stick and carrot. If they offer you carrots and you don't move, they will use the stick. And especially the point when Singapore makes a commitment internationally, they will deliver, and they must deliver. And one way, of course, is through legislation. But I can tell you that this use of legislation is just not unique to Singapore. It's also to other countries. So if you look at the EU, for instance, which is far ahead of us, they've already got this legislation in place a long time ago. So it's nothing new, but I guess it's new to a lot of people here in Singapore. But I think it's for, the intent is good, it's for the future. So we should not be looking at just what's going to happen in the next 3 or 5 years. So I think this debate in government, in Parliament by Grace Fu, that we need to look down the road. Yeah. So this carbon tax is not just about what you need to pay additionally in the next few years, but we're looking down the road, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. What kind of a Singapore, what kind of economy are we going to kind of build, and how sustainable would that be?
Thanks, Kok Wing. Eileen?
I think I can share a little bit about, just a quick one, when we talk about trying to convince costs versus savings. A very simple example is the solar panels that we installed. Not cheap, but the lifespan of solar panels is 25 to 30 years, right? It's going to take us 4.5 years to make back the cost. After that, it's all savings, which we will then reinvest in more sustainability initiatives.
Good insights, yeah. Thank you. Sorry to keep you waiting. Yes, last one. Yep. Okay.
Yep. Thanks for the airtime. My name is Jason Liao. I run the financial advisory business for Edelman. We're a new brand, Edelman Smithfield, and part of the work we do is ESG advisory. So it's with that lens that I want to weigh in on that earlier point about greenwashing and whether PR folks inadvertently contribute to it. So in the work that we do, we've found that a lot of the clients, they are very, very focused on metrics and disclosures. And that's a good focus, right? Because you want to be very vigilant on that front. But one of the weak links that have contributed to the perception of greenwashing is this relative neglect of stewardship. We work with a lot of financial institutions, and we found that it's this piece, right? They're working through their portfolio companies, shepherding them through the energy transition, that's oftentimes not picked up by PR folks. PR folks are not challenging the business people on clarifying what is the stewardship approach. What are the key strategic questions you're asking portfolio companies? And so that's the financial side, but with industrials and manufacturing, there are a lot of third parties in the supply chain. What's the business, what's the operations doing with these third party vendors, right? So I'd say it's not intentional. Nobody wants to greenwash intentionally, but I think a large part of that neglect is with not taking care of that stewardship piece, and we often encourage PR and comms folks to deal with that, to sit down with the business folks and say, tell me that stewardship story, right? And I want to throw this back to the panel to see if you're seeing the same thing, gut checking with you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let me jump in here. Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Yeah, ESG is evolving. I learn a new thing every day. Yeah, I hope to be like Ken. At his age, I'll still be learning, but I'm learning every day. Yeah, it is very complex. So to your point that you raised, it's absolutely correct that we as practitioners need to stay curious, need to stay attached and connected. I'm not saying that you need to be an expert, because expertise is just round the corner. A few keystrokes away, a phone call away. You have all these experts around you. You can tap on them. But I think as a practitioner, and maybe this is my kind of a sign-off tip for all of you, we need to then adopt, and I think this was touched upon, and I think there's a session coming up this afternoon, which is, I think, very appropriate. We need to have design thinking, systems thinking, future thinking. You need to start imbuing this into your operations, in how you practice your communications. Because the world has changed. How we look at problems 20 years ago and how we solve it, you can't use the same tools, right? So these three things, right? Design thinking, futures thinking, systems thinking. These are things that you need to start applying to the solutions and the questions that you need to ask your clients.
Thank you, Kok Wing. And on that note, I think we'll call this session to a close. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their insights this morning. And to all of you, I wish you well also in your sustainability journeys. Right? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So Chin, I'll come to you and tell you more about how you can measure S. All right?
Thank you, guys. I mean, that was really insightful. A lot to cover. Please, there's no way we can finish everything. So if you have questions, please approach the panelists. And now we move.